It's 11:15 in the morning on a particularly chilly day. A soldier stands atop the fort of Guadalupe, behind the city of Puebla, not far from Mexico City. A cannon fires, and it signals the beginning of the day's events. The soldier looks on absolutely terrified. 5,000 men of the French Imperial Army, the world's finest infantry, have begun their march on the city that he is charged with protecting. Artillery fire begins to rain down on the French with surprising precision. But suddenly, from amongst the French ranks, trumpets are heard, and 4 out of the 5,000 men that were marching pivot sharply to the right, and they start their march directly at the fort on which this man is standing. The day is the 5th of May, 1862. The battle for Puebla has just begun.
Oh, I got chills, Tavo. Thank you for that stirring narration of the first instances of the Battle of Puebla. Of course, you'll go on to tell us the rest of the battle, I'm sure, but give us a little bit of context. Why are we in this relatively medium-sized city, very important city, but medium-sized city on the way between the Atlantic coast and Mexico City? Why the French even here?
We don't want to get too much into the weeds of why the French decided to make their way here, because that's quite a long story. But suffice to say that the French were there under the pretext of collecting some debts from the Mexican government, a government which had decided not to pay certain debts. However, the real story, I think we can agree, is that Napoleon III, who at this time is Emperor of France, he is the nephew of the great Napoleon Bonaparte. He has great imperialistic ideas. As we said, he commands the world's greatest infantry with no close second. And he's trying to become, master of the world. This is the 19th century. And he's not alone in these kinds of endeavors. Importantly, the United States at the moment, just north of Mexico, is in the middle of a raging civil war. Now, though the French can at this time probably still defeat the Americans, it's a lot easier to expand your empire in the Americas when the US is otherwise engaged. And that is the core of why France is choosing this moment to try and take Mexico.
But we're getting way more specific here. We're going to talk about the 5th of May, where I love it when a date is the literal day and not the year, because no one remembers, it's 1862. What they care about is that this is El Cinco de Mayo.
Of course, the very famous Cinco de Mayo, which many people believe is Mexico's Independence Day. Let me clarify that it is not Mexico's Independence Day. It is the anniversary of a great battle fought between the French Imperial Army and the Mexican Liberal Army.
And we'll be talking about why it's so important on the day, in the immediate aftermath, and culturally from thereafter to our own day.
So let's go back to 1862. It's a few days before the 5th of May that an army, 6,000 men to be precise, arrive headed by a man with the name of the Comte de Lorenzé, a general from the French Imperial Army. Now, the Comte de Lorenzé came from an aristocratic family, a minor aristocratic family, must be said, and as a good aristocrat, he had an incredibly high and mighty view of himself in the world, and specifically as regarded his post in Mexico, he believed that it was entirely beneath him. Just to give you an idea of the degree of disdain in which he held Mexico, the Mexican army, and the post he'd been given, this is a little bit of a letter that he sends to his boss in Paris just a few days before the battle takes place. He said, "We have over the Mexicans such a superiority of race, organization, discipline, morality, and elevated spirits, that I beg you to inform the Emperor that from this moment on, and at the head of 6,000 soldiers, I am the master of Mexico."
I love nothing more than a Frenchman getting his due after a letter like that. There's something that unites Mexico, Britain, and the United States, more or less from then on, which is a distinct disdain for the arrogance of the French.
And Lorenzé was particularly arrogant, because one thing is to write these kinds of things, which are not dissimilar to what, say, General Cornwallis was writing in the case of the American Revolutionary War, or the British wrote in India, and so on. But he then follows with some very arrogant decisions. And the most arrogant of them all pertains to the way in which he decides to tackle the Battle of Puebla. Now, A little bit on the geography here. Puebla at the time was a relatively small city. It was protected by two great hills, on which atop sat two forts, the fort of Loreto and Guadalupe. Now, as Lorenzé is making his way to Puebla, he has conservative advisors. These are the same conservatives that we spoke about in a previous podcast. These are the men who believed that a conservative government should be at the helm of Mexico. They have fought and lost a civil war, but they're not taking no for an answer. They've gone to Europe and asked for help. And here they are advising Lorenzé, and they tell him that the best way to attack the city of Puebla is one of two options. Either you go around the city and attack it from behind, as the Americans had done not 20 years prior. The other option is to follow a nice flat road that brings you to the side of the city with some obstacles to surmount, but mostly unprotected. However, Lorenzé says absolutely not. Not only am I going to take the day, I'm going to take it in the most difficult way possible. And what Lorenzé goes for is the silliest decision you could come up with in this scenario, which is he says, I'm going to charge straight at these two forts that sit on top of two mountains. Now, of course, in order to take the city from this way, you would have to charge up a hill, well, two hills, make it to the sort of saddle that forms between the two hills, fight an infantry division there, while the whole time being shot at with cannons and muskets from the forts. So a ridiculous idea. But this is the idea that he chooses to follow. Now, things do not start out very well for Lorenzé, because, as we've said, the artillery fire that begins to rain down on the French the moment the battle begins does so with extraordinary and surprising precision. So much so that we have multiple letters from French officers saying that they were certain that it must have been the case that the Mexicans were being helped by, be it American or Prussian mercenaries, because there was no way that they could have been firing with such precision. The truth is that it was the Mexican artillery officers who were firing with such precision. They were just having a particularly fine day. However, artillery is only a little bit of the battle. At the end of the day, in this time, it was still about infantry tactics, and it was all going to come down who had the best infantry at hand. And that, of course, was the French. Now, once the French make it up the hill and are able to engage with the Mexican infantry, the first assault comes in, led by French elite soldiers, and they are pushed back. Then the French regroup, and they go for a second assault. And the second assault is once again surprisingly pushed back. But then, and of course it's not lost on the Mexican soldiers that they are going up against the greatest infantry force in the world, there is an element of thinking, third time's the charm. We've done it twice, can we do it again? The third assault comes in, and the Mexican line begins to waver. First one man, then two, then a handful, then a dozen. And it's at this moment that the Battle of Puebla really turns into something out from a movie, because two extraordinary things happen almost back to back. The first of these is a general by the name of Miguel Negrete, who's standing on top of one of the forts, looks down at the infantry line that is beginning to waver between the two forts, and he sees these men running away, and he unsheaths his sword, and he runs down to these men, and I am not making this up. This is something that sounds like Shakespeare. He says to them, in the name of the fatherland, up and at them, boys. En el nombre de la patria, arriba y a ellos, muchachos.
It's what makes the Battle of Puebla such a remarkable moment in history, because it is basically cinematic melodrama. It's all accidents, ridiculous over-the-top characters, and when I first saw this in your notes, I saw Negrete and this amazing quote that you can't make up, basically. It looks like a script, Shakespearean in nature. And I literally thought you were going to talk about a movie produced 100 years later with Jorge Negrete, not Miguel Negrete, at the front of an actual incredible line shouted on the day.
Definitely. I mean, for those of you who have seen the Patriot, the great Hollywood film about the American Revolutionary War, the scene is exactly like that, except this happened in real life. And we're pretty certain it happened because multiple officers left records saying that Negrete did this and said something to this effect.
And so it's a good reason to remember why this is such a poignant moment in Mexican history. Of course, it's what we will inevitably see as a great victory against Goliath, but it's also just how wonderful and cinematic every moment is. Just to rewind a bit, we've talked about the arrogance of the French, but there's a lot of bravery from the Mexicans that even I think the Mexicans were surprised by. The Mexican general in charge of the Mexican forces at Puebla was a man called Ignacio Zaragoza. And he, as far as I understand, told his men, you know what? If you want to leave, get out of here. We'll get as many of these people in their linen clothes and their straw hats to come and defend what is their land. And I think that's an inspirational moment that can get overshadowed by the sheer incompetence of the French.
Absolutely. And the most extraordinary thing to this point is that Negrete succeeds in convincing these men who are running away from not doing so and coming back to the battle. These are not just soldiers, as you say, Alex. Some of these people were just taken out from the city and they had chosen to fight and defend their city. So they turn around and they go back to this wavering line to try and push back the French. And here is where the second completely extraordinary thing happens. We must note that this part of Mexico, like much of the country, doesn't have continental seasons. It has a rainy season and a dry season. And early May is still very much the dry season. But the extraordinary thing is that all of a sudden, towards 2:30 p.m., the sky turned a dark grey, and it started to rain. Now, I don't mean a drizzle, I mean cats and dogs. It was so much rain that the hill started to turn very muddy, so much so that the French started to trip and slip and slide down the hill, and then they were much more easily pushed back. And at this point, it's the French line that begins to waver. First a man, then a handful, and then, from behind the mountain, trumpets are heard, and roughly 200 Mexican cavalry appear at the top of the hill, and they begin their charge down. 200 cavalry charging at full speed ahead, cutting down Frenchmen by the dozen. And here, the 4,000 men who'd made it to the top of the hill start running away in complete disarray. Now, it seems, of course, that the day is taken, right? But Lawrence, as much as he was arrogant, he was not stupid. Remember that at the beginning, when the trumpets are heard, 4,000 men turn to the right. 1,000 men stay behind. Now, we mentioned at some point that there were 6,000 men. We're missing 1,000. Those 1,000 are a mixture of artillery, cooks, aide-de-camps, a bunch of other characters that aren't particularly useful. They're back at the French camp, and it's only the 5,000 that we need to worry about. So, Lawrence orders these remaining 1,000 reserves that he had to charge ahead and take the more reasonable route, or at least one of the more reasonable routes that he'd been suggested, the flat road that leads to the city of Puebla from the side. And these 1,000 men start marching ahead towards the Mexican reserves, who have been stationed on this road to protect this more obvious entrance into the city. And at the helm of these reserves, roughly 1,200 men, is a man who will be very important in Mexican history. But at this point, he's still a very young, eager officer. This man was General Porfirio Diaz. The reserves meet each other. Porfirio Diaz orders the first volley be fired, and without so much as a chance to fire a second volley, the French forces begin to run away. It really does seem now that the day is taken. Because mind you, something really important to bear in mind is military theoreticians of the time would have told you that without measure of a doubt, no matter how great your adversary was, if you'd managed to make them start a disorganized retreat, you had taken the day. There was no way that they were going to be able to turn back around, reorganize, and actually pose a threat. Therefore, the only sensible thing to do was to chase these men down and cut them down. And of course, Porfirio Diaz, eager as he was and fresh out of the military academy as he was, knows this, and he orders his men to charge. It seems the day is really taken now. But then, an extraordinary and truly extraordinary decision is made. Here you have Mexican cavalry cutting down the French. You have Porfirio Diaz and his reserve charging behind the French on the other side. The remaining French are sprinting for their lives, and the entire Mexican army is charging down from the forts while cannon fire is being fired from the Mexican side. This is absolute victory. And General Zaragoza orders them to stop.
Treachery.
One would think so, right? I remember the first time I read this, I said, I must be misunderstanding something. There's some, there must be a reserve somewhere that I don't know about and he knew about. Why would you order them to stop? Now, an obvious response would be, was it treason? Unlikely. Zaragoza is still very much remembered as a hero, unequivocally remembered as a hero. Up until not too long ago, he was still the face on the 500 peso bill in Mexico. So why does Zaragoza order this? The most plausible answer is that Zaragoza probably knew all of this military theory, but he also knew that military theoreticians would also have said that there was no way that the Mexican army could defeat the French army. So if they'd failed once, they might be wrong again. And I think his idea was cut your losses or, take your winnings and go home before you mess it up.
So he basically thought it was so unlikely that they were going to win this decisively that it must have been a trap. The Mexican victory couldn't have been that swift and decisive against the French.
Completely. There was no way to really explain how the greatest army in the world, in conventional warfare, would have lost such a disastrous defeat. So he says, all right, let's not risk this. Let's regroup. Let's just chase them in an organized fashion all the way back to the coast, make sure they get on their ship, and hopefully they won't come back again. Now, that might have seemed like a really sound, risk-averse, but sound plan in the context of the day. However, what Zaragoza could not have counted on is how the French Senate was going to react to this great humiliation. When word gets back to the Senate in France, there are two responses. The first one is a very clear and simple, I told you so. The French Senate did not want Napoleon III to send these troops to Mexico in the first place. They argued that there was a fiscally unsound decision, that the treasury was spread out thin, that the army was spread out thin, and there were other things to concentrate on than sending an expeditionary force to far away Mexico. So they're really enjoying this moment to point out to Napoleon just how stubborn and silly he is. But then, from amongst the Senate, you start hearing other voices, and these voices are pointing out that this is a great humiliation. How can it be that a tiny little country full of peasants with sticks, their view of the Mexicans at the time, could have defeated the greatest army in the world? This will not stand. And if you look at the facts, they said, they have not defeated us. At best, they have pushed back an offensive. But even they knew that they could not defeat us because if they had thought that they could, they would have chased us down. They would have cut us down. Everyone knows that. No. We must make amends here. We must send more men, and we must teach these Mexicans a lesson.
Bismarck couldn't have planned it better.
Exactly. And this will become particularly relevant in the Franco-Prussian War. But at this point, the Franco-Prussian War is not clearly on the horizon in any way. And the French Senate decides that something must be done, and 30,000 men are sent to Mexico this time around. Now, 6,000 men was a very small force, but 30,000 men at the time was quite a significant force because these 30,000 men would not have been fighting alone. They would be reinforced in Mexico by the conservative forces, which, as we've said, had fought and lost a war a few years prior, but they were nonetheless a sizable army and a battle-hardened army, now to be reinforced by a 30,000 army of the world's finest infantry. And indeed, what follows is that these 30,000 men with their conservative reinforcements take Mexico, not a few months later, and they will hold Mexico until 1867. In reality, the only reason why the liberal forces wind up winning is that in 1866, now in the context of what seems to be a coming Franco-Prussian War, of a strengthened Prussia and a weakened France, the French Senate now orders these 30,000 men back. The conservative forces are left alone in Mexico, and it is only then that the liberals manage to take back the country.
I might push back there somewhat, Tavo, because although you're absolutely right, the French were formidable and they had a really solid foothold in Mexico, there was something that was going to happen almost inevitably at some point, which was the United States was going to emerge from its civil war, and it was almost impossible that the Union was not going to emerge victorious. And crucially, the Monroe Doctrine, which was pretty fresh in Americans' minds at the time, which is the doctrine that says America for Americans, ambiguously phrased term that could mean it's for people in the whole of the Americas, the continent, North and South, or America for US Americans. Either way, This was very clearly stated by the US, and they were not happy with the fact that the French were intervening, even though they wanted to keep them on side at least during the Civil War. But as soon as that war was over, and you probably would never have expected this, Tavo, guns started to flow from the United States, coordinated by Union generals themselves, plugged into Benito Juarez's, who at the time was Mexico's president, his liberal forces. So American guns flowing into Mexico, bolstering this Mexican liberal army that at some point, I think, may have been able to dislodge the French regardless of the machinations of the Prussians.
Certainly. And here we get into the really tricky territory of what if, right? There is no doubt that the Americans were not going to ever be particularly happy about having a great European empire, let alone the French, just south of their border. Number one. Number two, the US at the time is not the US that we think of today. It is not the great unequivocal superpower of today. Of course, it is a great power. It is becoming an ever bigger power, particularly there is no close second to it on the American continent. However, the French, the British, still reign supreme. And it is unlikely that if it came to it, that the Americans could have actually dislodged the French if the French had wanted to fight this out till the very end. However, the point is well taken. The French had forces all over the world, and though they could probably beat the Americans in all-out war, this was only one of their many theaters. It is unlikely that they would have been willing to go into a super extensive war directly with the US for just one colonial theater. Whatever the case, the Battle of Puebla is a wonderful example of Mexico not capitalizing on its success, squandering the winnings, and ending up in a worse off situation than it started.
So this is a reference to the great victory of Cinco de Mayo, swiftly followed by a proper French invasion and actual defeat.
Of course. And if only this had only happened to Mexico once, that would be great. But the problem is that this has happened to Mexico over and over again. It is a recurring story in the history of Mexico. We're not going to get into all of the examples where this has happened to some degree or another. But we can talk about what might be a contemporary example that is going on today. In recent days, as all of you are most likely aware of, the Trump administration has chosen to wreak havoc in international relations worldwide, undoing a system that had been in place in some cases for 80 years, and in particular, as far as regards Mexican-American trade relations, very firmly for 30 years. And where other nations have not been able to deal with Mr. Trump particularly well, blowing themselves to openly insulting the president in parliamentary debates, to ridiculous commercials on the side of the Canadians. In the Mexican case, President Claudia Sheinbaum has been remarkably and surprisingly successful at dealing with Donald Trump. Mind you, we are recording this on the 30th of March. We're 2 days away from Trump announcing his new tariff plan, which we've been waiting now for 2 months. And it might come out that Claudia Sheinbaum was not as successful as we thought. We might see her approval ratings change dramatically. But as it stands today, March 30th, 2025, Claudia Sheinbaum has held towering successes in the international arena.
It speaks to the spirit of the Battle of Puebla, which is Claudia Sheinbaum has undoubtedly been enormously successful in dealing with Donald Trump over the past 2 months. But what we've had has been 2 months of relative reprieves. The history books, and maybe the history books have already been written in a month's time when we publish this, it could be that the history books say the 2-month reprieve was a brief pause in what was the continuous and inevitable fall of Mexico when it came to dealing with Donald Trump. And Claudia Sheinbaum might obviously have been just temporarily riding high until she fell low because no one can stand up to the United States. Or maybe not. Maybe she will be successful, but we simply can't know. It's just interesting to see how the celebrations, she had a massive party the other day in downtown Mexico City to celebrate the delay of tariffs. And it almost seemed like that was the end of the story. And if you ended the film there, she comes out like an enormous hero. But of course, we've got another 4 years of Trump. We've got another 6 years of Claudia Sheinbaum. We simply don't know what the next theater of war will be and how the proverbial French Senate will react to the humiliation of Claudia Sheinbaum having a nice party to celebrate that she stood up to Donald Trump. By the way, Trump officials noticed this and they didn't like this. I remember one saying specifically, demasiada fiesta, in his very American accent.
And the reality is that Mexico has historically been very good at dealing with the US through direct and indirect diplomacy, through direct and indirect speeches, through all sorts of spectacles that are carefully orchestrated to send messages to the US. Mexico has been very good at dealing with its northern neighbor that likes to often meddle in Mexican affairs.
I feel we almost need to do a whole episode on how Mexico wrangles the US. It's an interesting case study in itself.
Definitely. However, what one must note, and I think we have slightly different perspectives on this, but what we must note is that Mexico always remains quite dependent on the US. That part of that is inevitable because it is the greatest power of them all. But in many ways, Mexico is left playing second fiddle, left on its back foot, sort of always reacting to whatever the US comes up with in that particular moment.
And do you know what a really good example of that is? Cinco de Mayo. It's amazing how Cinco de Mayo is simply not a thing that happens in Mexico. No one really cares, except for the good people of the city of Puebla. But apart from that, it's Americans who care about Cinco de Mayo. And I don't know, but would you be interested in knowing why that is, Tavo?
I've always wondered. I have no idea why that is.
It's an interesting case of timing and location. So, as our listeners will probably know, northern Mexico became the southern United States less than 2 decades before the Battle of Puebla was fought. As Americans nowadays say, the Mexicans who were in the states of Texas, California, etc., the border crossed them. It wasn't that they crossed the border. And that meant an interesting position for them. They're in the middle of a civil war where they're not particularly on one side or the other. They're Mexican Americans without the hyphen yet. And the Battle of Puebla comes as an interesting reprieve because you had to do 2 things as a Mexican American. You had to assert your culture, right? You didn't want to get absorbed by the Anglos. But at the same time, you didn't want to antagonize the new government that ruled over you with an iron fist. And so the Battle of Puebla came as a godsend to Mexican-American communities. And again, this feels like a ridiculous coincidence, but the great hero of the Battle of Puebla, Ignacio Zaragoza, did 2 things right. 2 amazing decisions, not on the battlefield, but before and after. His first great choice was to be born in Texas. The man was a Texan. This man was very close to the heart of the people who are now Americans, Mexican Americans, who had family fighting in Mexico for the liberal cause. And at the same time, Zaragoza made another great choice almost immediately after the battle, which was to die. No better way of becoming a hero than to not have to answer for all the questionable things you do, like, for example, not chasing the French down as soon as you could, because he was dead. And so he immediately became a civic saint for Mexico, for the liberal cause. On the other side, the fact that the French were intervening in Mexico, this European imperial power, worked so well for Mexican Americans to not antagonize the United States, because the issue was, over the past more or less 20 years, the big antagonists for Mexicans were the Americans. This was the first time they could grab an outside baddie and make it a shared common cause between the Americans, who, as we saw with Sherman and Grant sending guns over to Mexico as soon as the Civil War was over, these American Unionists weren't too happy with the French intervening in Mexico. And so it was a way of asserting themselves culturally and their identity as Mexican Americans without upsetting the US. But that was almost in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Puebla. Fast forward 100 years to the US Civil Rights Movement, and again, the Battle of Puebla, Cinco de Mayo, has another resurgence under the onus of the Chicano movement. The Mexican Americans who were being repressed by the racist apparatus of the US government, and the Battle of Puebla was a way of reasserting, again, their identity without antagonizing the US. But as the civil rights movement fizzled out, an arguably stronger force took control of Cinco de Mayo. The force of marketing and capitalism. Beer companies eyed the holiday in the middle of the year where there's not much to celebrate, and as they did with St. Patrick's Day, Halloween, and other festivities that weren't necessarily all about the consumption, they made it so. And so beer companies and other corporations decided to run with Cinco de Mayo as the great celebration of Mexican Americanness, but also crucially of Hispanic consumers. Hooray for Cinco de Mayo and Heineken's bottom line.
I think Cinco de Mayo, for all the reasons that you say, is a wonderful example of the very many ways in which Mexico's and the US's fate is so deeply intertwined. Deep historical reasons that date back to the 19th century, in some cases even before, through the 20th century, and now the forces of the market. Mexico and the US are, for better or for worse, the fates of Mexico and the US are, for better or for worse, linked to one another. The big question now is, in a world with a changing set of rules, can Claudia Sheinbaum and her latest string of surprising successes capitalize on those successes and steer that relationship between Mexico and the US away from one of being on the back foot, away from one of relative servitude, to one of true allies and peers that can count on each other for many years to come?
Or to put it differently, will Claudia Sheinbaum, as Mexico is wont to do so often, snatch defeat from the jaws of victory?
Until then, I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
As always, every 2 weeks, we take you through Mexico's history, economics, and its politics. Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist to read all about this and more. Till then, toodaloo.